Hey everyone, welcome to today's deep dive, where we're really going to dig into a topic that I think is just so important for anyone raising or working with autistic kids,
Mm,
and that is how trauma impacts these kids.
right.
And we're going to be looking at the book Cheapaba, Understanding Trauma in Autistic Children, A Guide for Parents.
Great book.
It's a really, I think, an important topic to really kind of dig into because I think it's easy to think of trauma as these big, dramatic events, right?
Sure.
But as I was reading this, it really struck me just how much more nuanced it can be,
Yeah.
especially for kids on the spectrum.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
what might seem like just a minor blip to one child
Right.
could be completely overwhelming to another. And it's especially true when we're talking about like those unexpected moments that can really kind of blindside anyone, right?
Yeah,
Like
really.
think about a car accident
Mm-hmm.
or a sudden diagnosis or
Yeah.
even like a natural disaster.
Wow. Yeah, and those are the kinds of things that, most people would agree are really difficult to process.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, thinking about that through the lens of a child who might, process sensory information differently
Right.
or who relies on routines for that sense of, safety and predictability,
Mm.
those situations just, they must be so much more intense for them, right?
It's a crucial point, and I think it really highlights how, autistic children, they might not only just react differently to trauma, but they might actually perceive the entire situation differently right from the start.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not just about the event itself,
Okay.
but it's also about how their sensory world
Mm-hmm.
and their social understanding might be impacting how they, experience things,
Yeah.
you know. So, their reactions might not be what we would typically expect.
Like, what are some examples of that? Because I think that's so interesting that it's not just about the event, but how they're processing it.
Yeah, exactly. So, for instance, we often, associate trauma with like an immediate visible distress.
Right. Tears,
Yeah, exactly.
crying.
But with autistic children, those reactions can sometimes be delayed
Oh, wow.
and they can surface weeks, months, or even years down the line.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
And that can make it really tricky to connect the dots
Right.
and pinpoint that root cause.
Wow. So you could be seeing, some behavioral changes in a child
Right.
and have no idea that it's actually stemming from something that happened, months ago.
Exactly.
Especially because what might trigger them might seem, insignificant to us.
Exactly. Think about stimming,
Okay.
right? That's a common self-regulating behavior for autistic individuals.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be really easily misunderstood.
Yeah.
What looks like fidgeting or disinterest could actually be a child's way of coping with just overwhelming emotions.
So a teacher who doesn't, have that understanding could totally misinterpret the child's behavior.
Right.
And react, in a way that makes the situation worse, not better.
Exactly. And think about how frustrating that must be for that child.
Oh, absolutely.
It just underscores how important it is to remember that, what we consider a typical response to trauma might not apply at all.
Yeah, it's all about context, right?
Yes.
And understanding each child's, unique way of experiencing the world.
100%.
Yeah.
And speaking of unique experiences, one of the things the source really digs into is sensory sensitivities.
Right. We talk about those a lot on the show.
Right. And, a loud noise
Mhm.
or bright lights that, other people might just find jarring could be completely overwhelming for a child on the spectrum.
Right, right.
And it can push them into like that fight or flight mode.
Oh, wow. So something like a fire alarm, which, anyone I think would agree, even as an adult, can be kind of like, whoa, what's going on? It's stressful. But for a child who's already, got heightened sensory input, it must be like terrifying.
Exactly. And, this also ties back into the importance of routine for a lot of autistic children.
Mm.
Because it gives them that predictability,
Right.
that control in a world that can feel really unpredictable.
Totally. So then when that routine is disrupted,
Yeah.
even by something that we might consider small, like a change in their daily schedule,
Yeah.
Having to take a different route to school, it can be really, really unsettling, I imagine.
Absolutely. And especially if it's after they've already experienced some sort of traumatic event.
Oh, wow.
It's like their sense of security is completely shaken.
Right.
And those little things we might take for granted,
Mm-hmm.
they become monumental for those kids.
Oh, all right, this is all such important stuff.
Yeah.
But I imagine for parents and caregivers who are listening to this, it can feel overwhelming.
Sure.
It's like, where do you even start?
Right.
How do you begin to kind of navigate all of this?
Well, and the good news is that this book doesn't just leave us hanging with the why.
Right.
It also dives into the how.
Okay.
And it gives us some practical strategies that we can actually use to help support these kids.
I love that. Okay, so let's unpack some of those strategies. So say, in those initial moments after a child has, experienced something traumatic, what are some of the things that the source suggests, to help them feel safe and calm in those initial moments after?
Well, I think one of the most important things, and sometimes easiest to forget, is just being present.
Okay.
And I don't just mean like physically being in the room.
Right.
But like really being emotionally present. It's about kind of putting your own anxieties and reactions aside for a minute.
Right.
And just offering comfort and reassurance.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It's like, it's so easy to, in those moments, forget that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just,
Be there.
Be there, exactly. Be that calming presence.
Be that calm in the storm, exactly. And, the book actually gives some really concrete ways to kind of like make that happen. Like one thing that it talks about is the importance of safe spaces.
Okay.
And that doesn't have to be anything, fancy.
Right.
It could be their bedroom.
Or a comfy corner in the house, even just like a blanket fort. Oh, I love that. It's just any place where they can really feel secure and kind of like decompress. It's like you're giving them that sense of control, right? It's a situation that probably feels anything but.
Exactly. And then, going back to that sensory piece we were talking about, like sometimes just modifying the environment can make a huge difference.
Oh, sure.
So if you know that, like loud noises are a trigger.
Right.
Maybe you dim the lights in the house.
Yeah.
Put on some calming music.
Yeah.
Or even offer them, those noise canceling headphones.
Right.
If they respond to that.
Yeah.
It's all about like anticipating what their needs might be and proactively trying to create that sense of calm.
I love that. That's so smart. But I'm curious, for those times when like even their usual, calming methods aren't quite cutting it, what does the source have to say about those situations?
Well, I love this part. This is where they really encourage parents and caregivers to think outside the box.
Okay.
Like get creative.
Yeah.
Think about things like deep breathing exercises.
Oh,
Maybe you teach them to take those like slow, deep breaths and, imagine they're blowing up like a big balloon or something.
Oh, I love that visual. Yeah, that makes it makes it more fun,
Exactly.
Not so clinical feeling.
Exactly.
What else?
Honestly, like the sky's the limit,
Yeah.
It could be things like mindfulness practices, spending time in nature, even just like listening to music or engaging in a favorite hobby. It's about figuring out what works for that individual child.
Which speaks to the importance of observation too, right?
Yeah.
Like really paying attention to what helps them regulate, what soothes them, because, what works for one kiddo might not work for another.
100%.
Yeah.
And, it might take a little trial and error to kind of figure out like what clicks for them in those moments, but that's just part of, being a parent and working through this with your kid.
Yeah.
And, all of this kind of ties into that second prong of the approach that this book talks about, which is managing routine changes. Because even when you handle those initial moments well, the impact of the trauma, it can really linger.
Right. It's like those ripples,
Exactly.
spreading out on the water.
Exactly.
And we were talking earlier about, how crucial that routine is for so many autistic children.
Right.
It's that sense of predictability, that anchor in their day.
Exactly. And so when that anchor is ripped away, it can be incredibly disorienting for those kids.
Oh, for sure.
Especially in the aftermath of a traumatic experience.
Right.
So the source really stresses the importance of communication.
Oh,
Like,
right.
even if it feels like a small change to you.
Right.
If you know it's coming, prepare them in advance.
And not just like telling them about it, but really like explaining it in a way that they can really grasp.
Yes, 100%. And, think about using visual aids. Maybe that's a picture schedule.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Or even creating like a social story.
Right.
To walk them through step by step, like what to expect.
Oh, that's a great idea. Or even role-playing the situation beforehand.
Yeah.
Like almost like a dress rehearsal,
Exactly.
for what their day might look like.
Exactly.
That's so smart.
And then, obviously, we can't anticipate every change because, let's face it, life happens.
Life happens.
But the key is, even when those unexpected changes happen, to, as quickly as possible, reestablish those familiar routines.
Right, to kind of get back to that sense of normalcy.
Exactly. So,
Things are back on track.
exactly. And then finally, the source talks about incorporating calming activities into their routines. So it's like building in those little pockets of peace throughout the day.
Okay, I like that. So it's like maybe there's a calming activity that they do before school and then another one when they get home from school or,
Exactly. And again, it doesn't have to be this elaborate thing. It could be as simple as, 5 minutes of listening to music or reading a book, spending a little time outdoors, or engaging in a favorite hobby, anything that kind of brings them joy and helps them, manage their stress.
Yeah, that makes sense. Of course, all of this kind of begs the question, how do you even begin to talk to a child, especially an autistic child, about something as, as sensitive and potentially scary as trauma?
Right. That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels like such a delicate balance.
It is.
Because you want to protect them, but you also know that they need to process what's happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where this source's advice about how to actually have those conversations is so helpful.
Yeah.
Because it is this delicate dance, right? You're trying to find that sweet spot between shielding them from everything and then, not overwhelming them with too much information.
Yeah. And it's like, how do you even find the words? Right?
Exactly.
Because it's even for us as adults, it can be really hard to articulate what trauma is.
Right. And you're trying to explain it in a way that a child who, especially a child who might have difficulty understanding those social and emotional cues or even expressing their own feelings verbally.
Right, right.
So it's definitely a challenge, but the source has some really practical tips, I think, for navigating these conversations.
Okay, good. Let's dig into those.
Yeah. So first and foremost, it stresses the importance of, like we were saying earlier about just being present.
Yeah.
It's also about staying calm, and using simple, straightforward language, because it's so easy, I think, for our own anxieties to kind of seep into our words.
Oh, totally.
Especially when we're talking about something as, as heavy as trauma.
Right.
So it's like instead of bombarding them with all this, information and emotion, it's like take a breath.
Right.
And stick to the basics.
Basics. Okay. I like that.
Yeah, and it actually gives this great example. Imagine you're talking about a car accident, right?
Right.
Instead of getting bogged down in all the details,
Right.
you might just say something like, there was a car accident. Billy got hurt and he had to go to the hospital.
Okay.
Short, simple, to the point.
Yeah, no sugarcoating, but also no dramatization either.
Exactly. Just the facts delivered in a calm and reassuring way.
Okay, I like that.
And here's a key thing I think that often gets overlooked. It's not just about, delivering information.
Right.
It's about really creating that safe space for dialogue, So encourage them to ask questions. And that's any question, no matter how big or small it might seem to us.
Even if they don't have the language to necessarily articulate exactly what they're feeling, just the fact that they're asking questions shows that they're trying to process this in their own way.
Absolutely. And if those words aren't coming easily, be open to those alternative forms of communication.
Oh, that's a good point.
Maybe they're more comfortable drawing a picture or writing a story or even, acting it out with puppets, whatever it takes.
Meeting them where they are.
Exactly.
Using their language, not forcing them into ours.
100%. And this might seem like a little bit of a curveball, but the source also brings up this point that I don't think we often think about, which is media exposure.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
Because it's so easy to forget how much information, especially these days, kids are just bombarded with, especially online.
Constantly.
And not all of it is accurate or age appropriate, especially when we're talking about things like, violence or natural disasters, things like that.
Right.
So even if they haven't directly experienced trauma, they might be indirectly exposed to it through news reports or, even just conversations they overhear.
Totally, yeah.
And that repeated exposure can be really overwhelming, especially for a child who might not have the context or the emotional maturity to really understand what they're seeing and hearing.
It's almost like their minds are trying to process these big, scary things,
Right.
but they don't have, they haven't developed the tools yet to really grasp it,
Exactly. So the source, it suggests being mindful of their media consumption, especially after a traumatic event. It's not about creating this bubble you know?
Right, right.
But it's about being selective and creating balance.
Okay. So instead of, sitting down and watching the news, maybe you read a book together
Exactly.
or play a game.
Something, more calming and engaging.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of things that make a lot of sense, um, can we talk about self-care for a second?
Please. Yes.
Because I think, dealing with trauma, whether it's our own or our child's, it, it's exhausting.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because I think sometimes we forget as adults and especially as caregivers,
Yeah.
we need to take care of ourselves too. I think about that saying, like, you can't pour from an empty cup.
It's so true.
Right.
It's like on the airplane when they tell you to put on your own oxygen mask before assisting others.
Exactly.
Like, you can't help your child if you are, like, running on fumes yourself.
Absolutely. And taking care of yourself, it's not selfish.
No.
It's essential.
It's essential, yeah. And the source really encourages parents and caregivers to, like, actually prioritize your own well-being, make time for things you enjoy, even if it's just for a few minutes every day.
Yeah, those little moments, I think, make all the difference.
100%. And don't hesitate to reach out for support when you need it.
Yes.
Whether it's, leaning on your friends and family or seeking professional help.
Yeah.
There's strength in asking for that helping hand.
Well said. Well said. As we kind of, start to wrap up this deep dive, it's so clear that there's no one-size-fits-all approach here
Right.
to understanding or addressing trauma, especially when we're talking about autistic children.
Right. And I think, if there's one key takeaway from our deep dive today, it's that power of understanding.
Yes.
Understanding the unique ways in which autistic children experience the world.
Right.
And how those experiences might influence how they respond to trauma.
Totally. It's about approaching, each child as that individual.
Yes.
Recognizing their strengths, respecting, the challenges they're facing, and just meeting their needs with compassion and empathy.
Absolutely. And remembering that, even when we don't have all the answers and even when we don't fully understand their experience, just that unwavering support that we can offer can make all the difference.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. And on that note, we're going to leave you with this thought to ponder as you continue on this journey, I think, of learning and growing alongside, the children in your life. We talked about how sensory sensitivities and those disruptions in routine, those things that we talked about that can intensify the experience of trauma for autistic children. How might those same factors continue to impact their healing process, even weeks, months, or even years down the line? Something to think about.
Absolutely. It's definitely a question worth exploring as you, kind of continue to navigate the complexities of trauma and work to create that safe and supportive and healing environment for the kids in your life.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you all so much for joining us for this deep dive. Remember, knowledge is empowering, so keep asking questions, keep seeking understanding, and keep showing up for the people in your life who need you most. Until next time, take care.